Welcome to the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum, featuring timely conversations, practical insights, and resources for global cybersecurity professionals. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert. Today, ISF CEO Steve Durbin speaks with Jonathan Brill, futurist and author of the new book Rogue Waves, Future-Proof Your Business to Survive and Profit from Radical Change. They discuss ways organizations can prepare for the confluence of small events that can add up to major disruption, developing institutional resilience, and strategies to facilitate sound decision-making in the boardroom. Here's Steve.
So, Jonathan, it's great to see you. Thank you very much for taking the time to chat with me today. You've had a really interesting career. Hewlett-Packard, entrepreneur, innovation consultancies, lots of really interesting stuff. Tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, I spent 20 years running contract R&D firms. Started off being mainly physical products and started getting larger and more abstract. And maybe 2013, 2014, it started moving from developing individual products to developing portfolios of products to helping boards of directors figure out existential issues and large-scale policy problems. So working with the US government to understand US food policy and how we needed to evolve it. Working with a major food and beverage company to figure out how to build their entire portfolio of products. Working with a major consumer electronics company to figure out what was their strategy for AI acquisitions and how would they operate in a world where their core devices were no longer differentiated. And I got a call out of the blue. I really hadn't expected to ever have a job. And he said, hey, our CEO is really concerned about two kids in a garage disrupting the world because that's what Hewlett and Packard did. And we're now 80 years old.
Right.
And so they asked me to come in and look at what's their long-term future. What does it mean for their locations, their skills, their technology stack, long-term product category investments, and to help them move from thinking in a highly transactional way about how do we hit the quarter, how do we hit the week, to how do we hit the next decade? Because at the end of the day, your investors say they care about the quarter. It's really important. If you don't hit it, that's a problem. But what they really care about is, 5 years, are you going to be worth more than you are today?
Right. So lots of really, I suppose, varied exposure to different industries along the way to that, which I guess has helped you when putting together the new book that you've come out with, which I want to talk to you about because it's out today.
August 17th, yeah.
And it's called Rogue Waves. So tell me a bit about that, because, a lot of the people listening to this perhaps won't be familiar with that term. Security guys are probably familiar with black swans, but rogue waves are slightly different. Rogue waves are a little bit more sinister than a black swan, right, from my understanding. But tell us about it.
So I think there's a deep mistake when you think about black swans, that these things are unpredictable events. And that's what a black swan is. It's a thing that literally comes out of nowhere.
Right.
The reality is that's a very rare case. What happens much more often is that individually manageable events scale up and suddenly become unmanageable, right? A bunch of things that were supposed to be linear combine to become nonlinear. So COVID is a great example of this.
Right.
We look at this as a pandemic. It's terrible. It's the worst thing that's happened probably in my lifetime. But the issue is not the disease. The issue is that we put a population the size of Los Angeles on top of the existing population in Wuhan. We did that with 400 million people across China. We connected them by 16 high-speed rails. And between 2010 and 2020, we increased tourism out of China by 10 times, making it the largest tourism spender on the planet. So what really happened here is that a disease that was containable 10 years ago, 20 years ago, was suddenly not containable today.
Right.
It had nothing to do with the disease. It had nothing to do with infectiousness. All of that might be true, but the real issue is that all of these other things combined to create a nonlinear event that we couldn't control.
Right. So just looking at that from a sort of security standpoint here, it seems to me that what you're talking about is the environment changing, right? So from a security standpoint, here we are, we're doing a number of things. We know how to manage cloud. We know how to manage devices. But you put those things together with an end user who now is no longer in a secure environment because they're working from home, to your COVID point, and suddenly you've got a much bigger issue because you can handle each of those different things in isolation, but the combination is the challenge.
I think that's exactly the case. And when you take a look at a rogue wave in the deep ocean, this is what happens. 1, 2, 4, 5, 10, sometimes 12 small waves overlap at the same time to literally in 2 minutes create a 100-foot wall of water that seems to come out of nowhere.
Right. So how do we prepare for rogue waves then?
So I think there's the obvious first question that I'm guessing that your audience are good critical thinkers is, well, we can't prepare for every possible rogue wave, right? They come out of nowhere. But I think you can actually prepare for every type of rogue wave, that these things have reasons that they exist. They have shapes, they have forms. And that means that you can start to prepare for things that you aren't fully expecting to have happen. There are 2 ways to look at this. One is what I call the 4 foes of growth, right? What are the financial risks? What are the operational risks? What are the strategic risks? And then the second is, what are the characters of that wave? What are the characters of the change? And so when you take a look at maybe from a game theoretic approach, what can possibly change the rules of the game? What can possibly change the system? Things can go from being static to dynamic or the other way around. So that's how insurance works, right? Is you have this dynamic risk. We don't have a house fire. We don't have a house fire. We don't have a house fire. We have $10 million of damage, right? You buy insurance, all of a sudden that's a static risk. It's a known payment every month. Things go from symmetric to asymmetric. So these are things that are impacting everybody, and so they don't matter, to they're things that impact me and not my competitors, so they do. So one of the things that Toyota did after 2011, after the tsunami that shut down the Daiichi power plant, they started stockpiling 6 months supply of semiconductors. And so today, for the last year, other companies haven't been able to ship product. They're doing just fine. They're in a great capital position. And as those supply chains get worked out, they're going to be starting from full speed where everybody else will be starting from half speed. So they took what was a symmetric issue and made it asymmetric. So you can do things like that. And then the third is synchronous versus asynchronous. Does it hit everybody at the same time, or does it hit people at different times? Right. So if you have more time, if you have a larger buffer to respond, you can often do really different things. Right. So this has to do with if you have a denial of service attack, for instance, making sure that you have extra buffer within your ecosystem so that you don't get hit. So you have some time to respond. And is it permanent or is it temporary? So you take a look at, we're talking a lot about inflation. That's the big talk of the moment. And the question is really whether this is temporary, these are supply chain shocks, these are getting back up to speed, or whether there's actually embedded inflation, whether this is a permanent change in the cost of doing business. So those are the things, those are what I call the risk switches that shape rogue waves. And so you want to be thinking about, how do they all impact your 4 foes of growth? How do they impact your finances? How do they impact operations? How do they change the impact of external changes? And how do they change your strategy?
And you talk as well in the book about scenario planning. So the ability for an organization or for leaders, leadership teams, to take some of these things you've just been talking about and just play them through, right?
Right.
You mentioned it specifically, I think, some dangerous waves. There are 3 that you mentioned as being dangerous waves that you see coming. You talk about the end of globalization. You talk about tech-based differentiation. And then the third one you talk about is political volatility. So tell us a little bit about those 3. Why those 3 in particular?
They were pulled out as examples of common conversations that I have with boards and with leadership teams. We have made a series of assumptions about our businesses, about our futures as companies, and they've been embedded into our processes. The first is that globalization will continue, that trade harmonization will continue, that the European project will continue. The reality is those things may be true, but we have a growing tension between the United States, between China, increasingly in the next number of years between India, and perhaps with the EU trying to feel its oats as you have more fracturing, a more multipolar world. And that means that a lot of the attempts we've made at globalization, at spreading capabilities around the world, they might or might not be relevant. The lowest cost producer might or might not be the safest producer for us moving forward. ZTE, Huawei discovered this all of a sudden a couple of years ago when Trump decided to rattle the Chinese cage. That's going to continue. And so that's the first issue. The second is technology differentiation. So we've been looking at technology as a differentiator, technology as a growth factor, but we're starting to see two things happen. One is questions about the long-term viability of Moore's law, right? That will we continue to have the technology-driven growth that we've had before? Not completely clear to me that we will. We can do things with co-processors. We can do things elsewhere in the technology stack. But the question is really, will transistors continue to increase in density at the rate that they have? It's highly questionable. And I think it's highly questionable that quantum computing will come in on the right timeline to offset those risks.
Right.
The second issue is that we're seeing a non-linearity in data production, but a linearity in network bandwidth, upload speeds. And so that means that we're pushing more and more and more technology to the edge of organizations instead of to the data center.
Right.
And more decision-making down here. And so the question becomes, do battery technologies move at the same rate as well as the semiconductor technologies? There's some real questions, some real issues that I have about, will we continue having technology moving at the same speed? And if it moves at a slower speed, that means everyone else has a chance to catch up.
Right.
When you take a look at semiconductor production, research investment in China today, for instance, why are they doing that? Why are they trying to catch up now? Is because everything else seems to be slowing down.
And the political volatility piece as directly impacting business, that's an interesting one. And again, in the book, you do mention, I think you say something like, I'm going to paraphrase here, so I'm bound to get it wrong. That, America has to get used to the fact that it's going to slip behind China and eventually slip behind India as well. And that will have a very significant impact, not just on its ability to perhaps shape the way that the world trades with America and vice versa, but also perhaps on the American psyche.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a bit more about that, because I find that very interesting. And because, a lot of the time we're talking about a product, we're talking about supply chains, relatively sort of inanimate objects, if I could put it that way.
Right.
But this goes right to the heart of people, right? This is how people actually see themselves in the world, and therefore has an impact on the way that businesses are run and, entrepreneurship is born.
That's a great question. And I'm starting to sound a little bit like a China file here. And is mainly just to show the contrast between what the perspective, the insular American perspective is, and the reality. When you take a look at Chinese IP production over the, between 2000 and 2027, 2030, it's literally been on a straight line. And it's not just crap IP. It's not just the stuff that we like to say, hey, they're not innovative. It's high quality triadic patents, the types of patents that are protectable in all of the major regions of the world.
Right.
And what we're seeing is that's also going on a pretty linear path. By 2025, 2027, 2030, they'll actually be producing more high quality IP than the United States. They're already producing more high quality IP than Germany. Mm-hmm. Well, think about the implications of that, of what we think of as an innovation importer becoming an innovation exporter,
right,
and at the same time becoming the largest market for new goods, for technology, for innovation on the planet. It shifts the entire perspective. It shifts the psyche of where business happens, where innovation happens, who does it, who it's done for, right? Who's our primary market?
Right.
And I don't think that the United States is ready for that. When you take a look, when you actually read the details of the latest US government spending bills, they're very reactionary. They aren't looking at what happens after space. They aren't looking at what happens after biotech. They're trying to catch up. And I think that's a really, really dangerous place to be in. When I work in China, when I go to China, what I see is an entirely different world than what I hear in the media here. I was out in Western China a couple of years ago, and I went to buy a piece of fruit from a street vendor. And I tried to pay her, the street urchin, tried to pay her in paper money. And she looked at me like I was a Neanderthal because everybody there used Alipay, used Tenpay, used digital currencies.
Right.
Over here, we're still having a conversation about whether that's a real thing.
Right.
And I think it's really dangerous to think that because the United States has led the way out of World War II, that we'll lead the way out of this crisis.
So we need to become more comfortable, I guess, with speed of change in general, And a point you make in the book again is with uncertainty. So one of the things that struck me was this theme that you have there about, the need to become comfortable with uncertainty. And you make a point about trying to identify likelihood markers as a means of then helping you to assess that. I thought that was a very interesting way of looking at it. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So as decision makers, we've all sat in the room and everyone comes out with numbers and statistics and they've got their data. And especially if you're in a technical organization, everybody's got data 10 miles deep and everyone's, you've got engineer etiquette, which means that you've got to kick everybody's tires and, and all that stuff. The reality is, at the end of the day, most important decisions are made under uncertainty.
Right.
And none of that data is typically relevant. It's the gut feeling of some senior executive based on their historical experience. That's a terrible way to make decisions in a world that's changing. And that's because historical experience is based on a world that was, not the world that will be. You need to figure out how to have a rational conversation about what you know, what you don't know, and whether your core assumptions have changed. And so what I propose, and this is something that the CIA does, if you listen really carefully to national security briefings, they'll say things like, that's pretty likely, it's highly certain, it's not very likely. Well, if you take a look actually at the history of CIA documents, those terms tie very closely to a percentage basis of likelihood. I think it's 80% likely. I think it's 60% likely. And I think it's really important as a group to understand what multiple people's perception is of that likelihood of an event occurring, because then you can go back and you can say, okay, well, have our assumptions changed? Do our perceptions of what's likely to happen, have they changed as well? If you don't write it down, these things get lost in the sands of time. And so you need to really get very specific, very granular about marking your confidence. The second thing that does, especially if you do it in an anonymous way, everybody writes it down, for instance, and passes it around the table, is you get a much better, more apolitical answer to the question.
Right.
People can't hide behind wiggle words.
Right.
And because it's anonymous, it's both very specific and they have the political flexibility, of a silent vote.
Right. It's an interesting way of doing it, isn't it? Because that, as you say, the important piece is to try to bring a degree of objectivity and to give everybody a voice. And we've all sat in meetings where people are just sitting there waiting for the CEO or whoever it might be to give his or her view. And then, we go from there. So I like that.
To that point, I think there's a second piece that is, as a leader, when you go through that loop, explain how you thought about the question, how the conversation changed that thought.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then maybe you can say what you think, but certainly say it last.
Right. Yeah, that's good advice. And I'm thinking about that particularly from a security standpoint, because one of the challenges that chief information security officers, risk practitioners talk to me about all the time is, trying to get the message across in a constructive fashion, in a way that isn't being viewed as perhaps, here we go again, this is security asking for more, and what are we going to get back? It's trying to take away all of that emotion, really. And you also make another really interesting point in the book, which is about moving towards risk-benefit based analysis. So taking some of these likelihood things we've been talking, but then trying to say, well, what is going to be the difference if we spend money here versus over there? How are we impacting risk? What are the benefits we're going to get from it? You must have used that technique multiple times with leadership teams. Could you give us just an example, perhaps, of one time where you used that, just to flesh it out a bit for the people listening?
So as I understand, you're talking about what are the upsides, what are the downsides? Mm-hmm. And do we have the right portfolio of risk? Okay. This is a constant conversation, right? We need to invest this, we need to invest that, we need to invest in growth. The reality is that risk and reward are intertwined, but they aren't two sides of the same coin. And so the question really is, how do you create the lowest risk opportunity with the highest reward? Right? They're parts of the same equation, but not parts of the same coin. And the way I think about it oftentimes is, obviously what can we mitigate if we look forward into a process? Are there places where we can time, where we can sequence, where we can hedge that process differently to offset the bottom side of the risk tree and maximize the probability of going to the top? And there are often really simple solutions. So a simple business example is if you're a manufacturing company, right, it's often really good to get paid for your materials before you buy them.
Right.
That brings your risk pretty close to zero. Or make sure that you have your capacity filled before you build the factory.
Right.
Those are really simple things you can do. But often you need to go a step deeper and look at what I call the 5 nudges.
Mm-hmm.
And what combination of, and these are, if you're a data center guy, I worked a lot in data centers early in my career, these will sound really familiar. Where do you put in air gaps? How do you decentralize and distribute? How do you either increase or selectively decrease bandwidth? Where do you add or subtract latency? And where do you want chunky versus smooth scalability? And if you start looking at your system in terms of where can you put those things in to modify risk, to modify the upside and the downside, often these are small little things, right? They're putting, a doorstop on the door so it can't close, or putting a lock on the door so it can't open.
Right.
There's simple things that radically shift the probability of a downside. Sometimes you need to really think about, and I'm guessing you can probably imagine having those conversations on a daily basis, but having that structure as an executive of what's the model you're working with and what are the parts that we can add or subtract to the system, I think it really helps everybody else understand where you're coming from. There are lots of ways to solve this problem. We can use air gaps. We can use distribution and decentralization. We can increase or decrease the bandwidth. We can change the latency. We can figure out how we move from smooth to chunky scaling or the other way around to shift the risk of something rapidly accelerating or rapidly decelerating.
Right.
Sometimes you can do that. Sometimes you can't. And when you can't, you need to innovate. And this is where I think the most important conversation is. What's that portfolio of innovation that we're doing? Almost always when I talk to companies, I'll go in, I'm working with one right now. They have 10 technologies. So they're really excited about 2 or 3 of them. And I ask why. And it's the answer, there's lots of gobbledygook, but the real answer is because I'm excited about 2 or 3 of them,
right,
because we're tech geeks.
Yep.
That's a terrible way to make investments. And so what I'm trying to encourage them to do is figure out within this portfolio, what are the growth investments, what are the sustaining investments, and what are the insurance investments, just like you would any, your stock portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
And what's the right mix? And when do they need to deliver? Right? Do you need to have one of these growth investments 100% need to hit in 1 year, 3 years, 10 years? Because that totally changes the type of investment that you're making, right? The type of investment that's a good idea.
Right.
And so just getting granular about that, I think, is a huge piece of the puzzle.
And as we look forward, of course, I think there is probably one certainty, and that is that markets will continue to become more volatile, more competitive. It will become much more challenging, but it's also going to be very exciting, if you get a buzz out of that kind of environment. And that's certainly the way that I tend to view the growth of the security market, volatility, increased competition, really emerging from, I suppose, a fairly mundane way of just securing stuff to being really intrinsic in the way that business is transacted. And if we're going to move towards that, if we're going to have organizations that are operating in that kind of environment, then nothing is more important than one of the other things you mentioned in your book, which is the resilience-based organization. Because you make the point that in an increasingly volatile world, you do need more than just a growth plan. You need a resilient growth strategy, which takes into account some of the things we've just been talking about. And I was struck by the fact that you break that down into a number of different phases, a number of different parts, of which, if I remember correctly, there were 4. I think you started with awareness, then you had behavior change. I think then you differentiated between behavior change and culture change before ending up at resilience. Tell me a little bit more about that, because I think that's a fascinating model for organizations.
If you think about the steps of change, whether it's in your life, whether it's your kids, whether it's your staff, whether it's your organization, 3 things need to happen. First, we need to be aware that there's a problem We need to be aware when is the earliest and when is the latest that we can respond to that problem. Otherwise, you end up running around in circles. The second is behavior change. We need to have a set of skills to make sense of the unknown, to make sense of the change. And I think there are really five, right? One is the reality testing. Most of us don't actually learn how to use scientific method in school in a rigorous way to get from an unknown to the most likely truth. So that's one step in the stack. Second is what I call observing systems. And so some of us, if you have a degree in economics, if you're a systems engineer, right, you understand completely how to observe systems, how to model them, how to do node link analysis, all of those sorts of things. Most people don't know that. The third is generating your futures, understanding that there's a broader range of futures than you're probably considering or are acceptable. And what we've discovered this year is that you can have an AMC year or you can have a Zoom year, right? You can have all of your movie theaters go out of business if you're AMC, or you can have this exponential scaling where you have a completely different problem. And you need to be prepared for both of those options. How do you respond? And you respond by what I call uncoupling your threats from your opportunities, making sure that if you do have that downside, you have enough upside on the other direction. So one example is HP versus Xerox. Xerox cut a lot of its counter-cyclical businesses and really dug down on office printers.
Right.
January of 2019, they were doing great. This year, their earnings per share are down 60 to 70% based on, or 69% based on how you account for it. HP, on the other hand, has been far more resilient because of investments it made 3, 5, 7 years ago to this entire thing. And their revenue has been actually stable and their stock's at an all-time high. So, you want to figure out how you uncouple your threats from your opportunities. And then you want to figure out what are the experiments, what are what we talked about earlier, those growth sustaining and insurance experiments that will allow you to make sure that you hit your growth and your profitability expectations on the timeline that you need. So those are the behavior change skills. And almost all of us have some combination of those, but most teams are skewed toward 2 or 3 out of the 5. Right. And so you need to figure out how you backfill the others. Then we talked about culture change. Culture change is really important because you can do all the awareness training. You can run around screaming that the sky is falling, convince everybody of that. You can give them all the skills. But if you don't have the processes and you don't have the incentives within your structure, within your organization, within your culture to sustain this type of thinking, it doesn't matter. So you need to have that culture shift. And I think about it slightly differently than most of what you might have heard. I don't believe you can change an organization's DNA. I've actually never seen it work. But there's another analogy, which is RNA. So DNA is the code that builds life, but RNA is the code that changes the way that you build proteins, regulates the proteins that you build. So this is the code that changes process. That actually is much more flexible. So when you take a look at an octopus, for instance, it'll change 60% of its RNA in its lifetime. And that means that it can move from living in Puerto Rico in the tropics or subtropics all the way to Antarctica, the same species. In the same lifetime, it can recode itself to respond to radical change. And I think that's what we need to do as organizations, be really specific about what are the hard incentives, what are the soft incentives, what are the processes that will sustain our ability to think about both resilience and growth as opposed to over-rotating on one or the other.
And I think that for me is one of the key takeaways from the book. I mean, I must admit, my thanks to your publicist for sending me across that early edition, because I really did enjoy pouring through it. And, the time we spent just talking about some of these things really hasn't done it justice. There's a whole wealth of information in there and some really helpful tips and approaches that are relevant, I think, not just to business leaders, but as I said, to pretty much everybody in an organization. So thank you very much indeed for taking the time to put a little bit of flesh on the bones there around that. Jonathan, been an absolute pleasure. I understand the book is out today, so that'll be available on Amazon and presumably in bookstores, so people can go out and get a copy. It's called Rogue Waves, Future-Proof Your Business to Survive and Profit from Radical Change. And I look forward to talking to you again about some of these things and hopefully in the not too distant future. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
Absolutely. Anytime. Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much to this week's guest, Jonathan Brill. Next week, we'll speak with Josh Jackson, Executive Director of the AI Association and Global Head of Government and Public Services at 6Click. Here's a preview of that conversation.
Even in business, we like to use the term sunk cost rather than here's a new situation, here's a new opportunity. This is going to give us a faster response time for cybersecurity, or this is going to give us more opportunities to combat a bacteria, right?
Right.
Change the game in terms of antibiotic resistance, change the game in terms of how do we automate and get more food in the hands of individuals, change the opportunity for being able to communicate, right? We're communicating from across the pond, right?
That's right.
And I think the more we work on it and the more it continues to evolve, then we're going to have a faster response time even here. So that's kind of how I look at it. Is I think we need it individually. We need to change that narrative that's going on, and we'll be able to work through it once we see the possibilities.
We'll be back for the full interview in a week. In the meantime, would you consider writing a short review of the ISF podcast? Reviews are a big support in helping new listeners discover our program, so if you do have a moment, we would be so grateful for your time. Is there a topic or a question that you'd like us to cover in a future episode? Let us know at securityforum.org. And while you're there, we invite you to explore our catalog of past video and podcast episodes, as well as ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like these. Find us on LinkedIn by searching CEO Steve Durbin or Security Forum.